Hearthstone over the years has had some really awful cards to play against, but there are some of them that really shine as the worst designed Hearthstone cards ever. The way that I defined a poorly designed card is that one person is guaranteed to have an awful time when that card is played. Before we get into the worst design cards in Hearthstone, let me know what you think is the worst design card. And while you're down there, make sure you subscribe. A lot of you are not, and I would appreciate it. A great example of this is Implosion, a 4-mana warlock spell. Deal 2 to 4 damage to a minion, summon a 1/1 imp for each damage dealt. Now, when this card was released, it was extremely powerful in tempo Zoolock decks, but think of it like this. Why would they design a card where the person playing it doesn't have any agency over how much damage it will do? Sometimes this was a 4-mana deal 2 damage, summon 2 1/1 imps. Other times it was deal 4 damage, summon 4 1/1 imps. Regardless of the situation, either you or your opponent was upset because, well, sometimes you high rolled and sometimes you low rolled. Crackle was another great example of this, of just a card that sometimes would give you lethal and sometimes it wouldn't. Thank God that Blizzard learned from this mistake, because they have not made another card like this and they probably should never do that ever again. One Night in Karazhan was a really strong adventure, but there's only one card in my mind that comes down as a horribly designed card that probably should have never been made. Barnes is a perfect example of a card that just makes one person guaranteed to be frustrated, because either you draw Barnes on turn 4 or you did not draw Barnes on turn 4. And if you did draw Barnes on turn 4, it would probably win the game for you, and that just seems like a card that is very poorly designed. The same thing could be said about Prince Keliseth, because if you had that on turn 2 and your deck got buffed, the game was drastically different if you didn't. And the same thing could be said about Incanter's Flow, except for Incanter's Flow is not a legendary, so you had double the chances of getting it. By the way, and I'm going to keep reminding everyone in these videos that this card used to cost 2 mana. The Rogue Quest from Ungoro was a perfect example of polarization, with the fact that once you played this quest against any control deck, you were almost guaranteed to win the game, but against aggro decks you would basically fall flat because you could not defend yourself. And I think in a game like Hearthstone, it's okay to have really good matchups like Control Warrior versus Freeze Mage, but it's not okay to just straight up win against an entire archetype and lose against an entire archetype. That seems like a really bad card. Patches the Pirate is a perfect example of a card that's too strong, in other words, really poorly designed, because it basically forced every single deck in the metagame to run it. And when you have a card that virtually gives you a free damage, it pulls a card from your deck and gives you +1/+1, you can see why this card was played in every single deck possible. The other really weird thing about patches is that sometimes you would just lose a game because you got it in your mulligan and your opponent didn't, and that literally just came down to RNG deciding the outcome of a game. A lot of new players may not know about mind control tech, but this was a 3-mana 3/3 battle cry. If your opponent has 4 or more minions, take control of one at random. Now, I don't think I really have to go through why this card is poorly designed, but just to give you an example, sometimes you would play this on your board, you would get your opponent's best minion, and you would win the game because of it, all because of RNG. So imagine you're pushing for lethal, you have to play another minion so you guarantee there's lethal on board, and your opponent plays mind control tech and wins the game because of it, and you had no right to lose that game. Disgusting card. I know I couldn't do this list without mentioning Baku and Gen, but I'm going to mention Baku specifically because this card was probably the more dominant of the two. I did a whole video on why Baku basically ruined Hearthstone, and the main issue with the card is that you can't really nerf it without changing the card text, because changing the stats or the mana cost is absolutely irrelevant because of the start a game effect. And if you can't nerf a card without changing its text entirely, that is the definition of a poorly designed card. Jade Idol is a perfect example of a singular card that can just kill an entire archetype, which was fatigue type decks. Because this card had the option to either go for tempo or go for a late game strategy of shuffling Jade Golems into your deck that eventually just became 30/30s, there is no way that attrition type decks could actually win a game against this archetype. The problem with this card as well is that it's in the similar vein of the Crystal Core, except for this deck didn't just auto lose against aggro decks because of other cards presented in the format. Druid actually had a pretty good matchup overall, but they just did not lose to any slower deck because of Jade Golems. And once again, if you're printing a card that just auto wins against any slower deck, that's pretty disgusting and probably should not make cards like that ever again. On the complete flip side, Duskfallen Aviana is a perfect example of a card of why the heck did they even make this, because it serves absolutely no purpose. This card gives the benefit to your opponent first. Why would you put that in your deck? This card virtually had no use case. Horribly designed card. Milhouse Mana Storm could be in the same boat as Duskfallen Aviana, but I think at least Milhouse had some kind of upside, which was a 2-mana 4/4 stat line, and back in Classic, that was a pretty good stat line. In Savers of Uldum, they decided to reintroduce quests for the second time, and there was a lot of really cool ideas, but one of the designs that they had for the Druid one was extremely weird. It just have unspent mana, and your reward for it was absolutely crazy. First of all, this reward was a passive effect, so you didn't actually have to spend mana to get the ability, but on top of this quest line kind of took away one of the more interesting mechanics of Druid, which is the choose one effect. So this quest took away one of the most interesting class mechanics of all time. It heavily constrains design space because now Blizzard has to be a little bit more careful on what choose one cards they release, and I think that would be okay if the quest was harder to actually complete, but the idea of just not spamming mana crystals is so ridiculously easy that I think this quest was just really poorly designed. In the Boomsday project, they decided to introduce really cool spell legendaries for each class, and Mage got Luna's Pocket Galaxy. Now this card is cool, but this card also suffers from the problem of you don't want this to be ever playable because of what it will do to the game. If it is playable, this deck will warp the format around it, and if it's not playable, it's just a dead card in Mage's arsenal. And if you think I'm wrong about this card, they did end up buffing it from 7 mana to 5 mana, and it was disgusting. Our next card is Prince Malchezaar, and this one's up to debate because this card effect is really cool and perfectly fine for meme decks, but it actually lowered your win rate a lot just by putting it in. Now, this card is a really fine line of super memey, but almost horrible design, because this card is virtually unplayable until you actively realize that you're putting this card into your deck to lose. And if you're okay with losing, then this card's probably not the worst design card we've ever seen, but it's pretty poorly designed. Just like Luna's Pocket Galaxy, Glacial Mysteries is an extremely interesting card. If this card is too good, then it's going to be meta warping, but you also have to make your deck around secrets, which is probably not great design because that's not great gameplay overall. This card is just extremely weird. Now, there is a lot of poorly designed cards I did not mention in this video, but I do want to talk about Unstable Portal because this card is the definition of too much polarization in an RNG card, because sometimes this would win you the game, other times it could just do absolutely nothing, and it doesn't have a prerequisite like at least Yogg-Saron does. Anywho, thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. I love you. I'll see you in the next one.